Have you ever thought about what will happen in a perfect world scenario where NVIDIA, AMD and game developers maintain support for old graphics cards by providing game-ready drivers and performance updates? How much future-proofing an aging GPU like this would have been, and which games could still run? Well, this is not a perfect world, so you might never get an answer. Or perhaps, by watching this video, you might do, but it may not be the one you like. Our guest today is the GameWorld GeForce GTX 760 Phantom, a graphics card based on NVIDIA's discontinued Kepler architecture that has been around for nearly 12 years. This card was once a true champion in the middle range category, and it also includes something a little special. Based on initial impressions, it seems that GameWorld approached things a bit differently at the time, offering the Phantom lineup with an unparalleled industrial design that set it apart from the rest of the competition. This card comes with 4GB of GDDR5 VRAM, in contrast to the typical GTX 760s which have half the memory, or even NVIDIA's same-gen flagship GTX 780, which is capped at 3GB of VRAM. Quite odd if you think about it, especially considering that games during that period did not require such a large amount of VRAM. Now if you ask why all the fuss about this video memory or VRAM or whatever, it is because this is where the graphics processor unit, or GPU, stores all the necessary data until it displays it on your screen as graphics. Typically, the more data a game contains, the greater the need for higher VRAM capacity. Overall, the GTX 760 was considered a great GPU for those who didn't have the money to spend on a GTX 780 or even a 770 but still wanted a capable 1080p performer. As such, GameWorld's GTX 760 Phantom managed to perform quite well in gaming back then. For example, GTA 5, which is the same age as our Kepler card, believe it or not, and after more than a decade of game patches on an operating system that didn't exist back in 2013, runs quite well at 1080 resolution and high settings across the board, producing 81 and 59 frames per second on average and 1% lows respectively. The same performance can also be seen in BioShock Infinite with its timeless graphics. It's a true showcase on how to develop a beautiful game without unreasonably demanding excessive computer power. It's no wonder that even at high settings and 1080p, we achieve an average of 105 frames and 80 in 1% lows. Another old but gold title from the same era is Metro Last Light, where the GTX 760 has no issues either. At 1080p on high settings in early levels, it achieves an average of 79 frames and 55 lows. This is a quite strong performance for a low to mid-range graphics card that lands at $285 with its 2GB variants priced at $245. Today, to achieve similar levels of raw rasterization performance on recent heavy AAA titles at 1080p resolution using recently released GPUs, you need to buy a mid-tier product with at least 10GB of VRAM, costing $315. Of course, all of the above is true only if you are lucky enough to live in the United States of America. Otherwise, you will have to spend much more, in some cases double that amount, just to have the same entry-level experience on modern games. Here is one more useful piece of information. GPU performance is also determined by how wide the memory bus interface is. That is the bridge between the GPU and the VRAM. It can be compared to a highway. The fewer lanes a highway has, the more narrow it is, the less data can travel. The wider that highway, the more data can go through in one pass. If a game has to send a huge amount of data at a given moment, and the memory bus interface is not wide enough to the task, it creates a sort of bottleneck effect that slows down the whole process. It's when you see those pesky frame drops while gaming. The reason I mention this is that it's amusing to see a mid-range card like the GTX 760 having the same number of lanes as the latest generation high-end graphics cards. Obviously, I don't make this argument to portray the 760 as equal to today's GPU flagships, but I want to point out that in some areas the technology has regressed. Or perhaps it was already too far ahead, similar to that unnecessary 4GB luxury Gainward offer with our Phantom model. I use the term luxury because, as we observed, games weren't very demanding regarding video memory in 2013. And unnecessary, since the only reason someone will pay more for the extra VRAM will be to play at 1440p, where the GTX 760 was somewhat weak in achieving high frames per second at that resolution. But I digress. Things have changed since then, right? Perhaps the extra VRAM on a GTX 760 was somewhat like future-proofing in a way that would actually benefit gamers in the long run. But how long? To anyone who made a purchase like that under this assumption, well, you have my deepest sympathies. Today, games showcase textures more detailed than ever, featuring incredibly complex visual effects, ray-traced graphics, and photorealistic worlds at sky-high resolutions. All of this demands unlimited rendering power and eats up VRAM like it's nothing, definitely over and above of what our poor Phantom card can provide. Moreover, one of the biggest challenges for the GTX 760 is that it technically supports DirectX 12, but only up to feature levels 11.0. This means it is missing some key elements that newer games require to run properly. This can lead to issues such as performance bottlenecks, graphical glitches, and even crashes. As if all the above were not bad enough, NVIDIA, during the worst period of time, decided to discontinue drive updates for the entire Kepler-based series, putting the final nail in the coffin of the GTX 760. All these factors created the perfect storm, rendering the 760 Phantom unable to even run games that, in theory, the card should have the power to handle. The hardware is willing, but the software isn't there to bridge the gap. This is one of the reasons why the majority of modern games don't list the GTX 760 in their minimum requirements. So, is this the end for the GTX 760 and all of its Kepler siblings? Is it time to add these legendary Titans and GTX 780 Ti's to your trophy wall? Fortnite says otherwise. You might want to hold on to your hats for this. I don't know why or how, but at 1080p performance mode, which is basically a stripped down DirectX 11, the GTX 760 managed to achieve an average of 203 frames per second and 146 in 1% lows. Even crazier is that it did this while running buttery smooth in a game that is notorious for the constant frame stuttering. And the surprises don't stop there. Counter-Strike 2, despite its initial hesitations, runs unexpectedly well on the demanding ancient map. At 1080p low settings, it reaches an average of 75 frames and 46 lows. Keep in mind that these results are under worst-case scenarios, so if you want to play CS2 with this card, you are good to go. But please, before you do, here's one more game that receives frequent updates. Path of Exile may not display impressive frame rates at 1080p resolution on low settings. Nevertheless, the overall experience is quite playable, with the average frames just above 60s and the 1% lows barely reaching 25 FPS. So clearly there are many games out there in which the GTX 760 can still perform quite well. But what's the secret here? What do these games have in common that allows the GTX 760 to shine? The secret is that all these games were tested in DirectX 11 mode, and that's where the GTX 760 truly excels. On the contrary, although the GTX 760 and all the Kepler cards support DirectX 12 on paper, they can do so only to a certain extent. They do not include key DirectX 11 features such as ray tracing, variable rate shading, and other advanced compute tasks that require more powerful modern GPUs. This is a hardware problem, which means no driver updates or game patches can solve it. Even if NVIDIA in an imaginary scenario were to take the drastic step of open sourcing its GPU drivers and allowing the community of developers and PC enthusiasts to contribute with ongoing improvements, bug fixes and optimizations, even that wouldn't resolve the issue with modern games that require full DirectX 12 support. Without a doubt, projects like the open-source Mesa drivers for Linux, which support various older graphics cards, demonstrate that community-driven efforts can sustain hardware for longer periods. However, even this is up to a point. It isn't a panacea, and definitely won't magically transform a GTX 760 into an RTX 4060. Obviously, this is such a huge topic that deserves a separate video to discuss, which is on my bucket list to do. For now, let's focus on the main takeaway from this video, which is to avoid becoming overly excited by things like excessive VRAM or the latest trendy tech features when deciding on your next graphics card purchase. Instead, be mindful of how long that hardware will actually be supported, especially regarding newer drivers, scheduled DirectX upgrades, and upcoming operating systems. Technology changes over time, and eventually every computer component, whether high-end or low-end, will inevitably subside by newer ones. This is how technology evolves. Who knows, maybe years from now we will be doing a deep dive on one of today's top-of-the-line cards, reflecting on the good old days of 4K and 8K and that crappy ray tracing with the frame generation nonsense, and the cycle continues. Now the question is whether you like to continue watching some of my other videos that might interest you.